J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Today we're going to talk about something you've probably experienced online if you're a Christian or if you're somebody who believes in God and you're talking to people who don't, and that is this simple question. Are atheists who you talk to online smarter? Because they'll tell you they're smarter. Are they smarter than us? Or are they simply more self-reliant and self-indulgent? What I mean by that is that we get this accusation all the time, right? That if you're a believer, it's only because you're too naive to either understand the science or understand all the evidence that points away from God. And if that's out there, I wrote a book called God's Crime Scene. I think we should. If there's good evidence to suggest that you can get everything that we see and experience in the universe from just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, well, then I would be out too. The problem is, if you look at those causes, the materials that are in the soup, those materials can't account for the experience we have in the universe. That's my argument in God's Crime Scene, rather. So, I've looked at this evidence as well. But the question is, are we just believing it? And sometimes we probably feed that sense that we're not all that smart because maybe we haven't studied the evidence to know why it is we believe something is true. Maybe we just were raised with this system. We borrowed it from our parents, borrowed it from our community, borrowed it from our culture at one time when the culture was actually affirming this kind of thing. Maybe we aren't smart enough to actually know what's true. And that's going to be the accusation you're going to hear online. If you've been on Twitter or been on any social media for very long, you know that most of the time we are going to get accused as believers of being the less smart of the herd, okay? The smart ones in the herd, they're the leaders and they're atheists. And the ones that aren't that smart that are being led, well, those are the believers. Well, look, I first started thinking about this after a report came out, which I have linked to on the article. I've written an article about this entire thing we're going to talk about today. So you can find it on our website at coldcasechristianity.com. It's just, are atheists smarter or simply more self-reliant and self-indulgent? And I'm really asking this question in response to a survey. And there's been a couple of these that have been out there that have argued that if you poll people who are not believers and you kind of test them in some way, they do seem to be smarter than us simpletons. So let me give you some of the, I'll just link to you. By the way, all of these reports, and I'm going to be talking about a lot of them today, they're all linked on that article. And the reason why I did that was just because there's no way in the 28 minutes we have today together that I can cover all the data in each one of the surveys I'm going to be referring to. So I'll probably be referring to a dozen or so. And they're just going to be, I'll show you them on the screen, but you really have to go to the links on our website on that page, Are Atheists Smarter or Simply More Self-Reliant and Self-Indulgent? And you'll see the links to all those. Let's just jump right in. There was a survey a number of years ago, and it was conducted in which it explored this question. It's at Sage Journals, and it's the relation between intelligence and religiosity, a meta-analysis and some proposed explanations. So basically, this is what this is a survey that measures the IQ status of people who say they're not believers and compares it to the IQ status of people who say they are. And they really are after this question. Do people at some point, are there just gullible people who believe in religion and smart people who don't? And this is what they determined. This is what they discovered in this survey. And it's telling in some ways. A review of 63 studies of intelligence and religion from 1928 to 2012 allegedly reveals the following. Non-believers, on average, score higher than religious people on intelligence tests. Now, look, I know we could probably argue the merits of whether, how was the study taken, what kinds of... Okay, forget about all that for a second. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that the tests are telling us something true, that there is a difference in IQ in between these two groups. Is that the reason, though? Because we're trying to figure out, is there a correlation here or is there a causation? Is this the reason why people who test higher in IQs, is it something about the nature of their investigative ability to understand the claims of Christianity, the claims of atheism? Is this what it is, that they are simply atheists because they're smart enough to know this is not true? Or is there something else correlated to intelligence that might really be the cause of why they reject the existence of God? That's what I think is happening. And I think you see this over and over again. My own experience with this was pretty simple. At the end of 9 years of university, a bachelor's degree, and then an extended period in which I was getting my master's in architecture, I will tell you that I was not a believer during any of that. And at the end of that experience, I was more convinced of my atheism than probably ever at any other time in my life. This is still maybe it's going to be another 3, 5, 8 years from this point before I become a Christian. So it's about 8 years after I graduated that I became a Christian. And I'll tell you that I was so committed to my atheism. Now, is that because I was smart? I graduated at the top of my class in both degrees. Not only that, when I was like 6, they thought I was kind of odd, so they pulled me out of class to give me an IQ test. And I rated really high, and so I was in these gifted classes from that point on in my education. And so I really thought of myself, this is the key, I thought of myself as a smart person. Now, the question is my intelligence what led me to atheism? Or is there something else that comes along with a sense of smartness that often leads us to atheism? And that's really the question that I'm trying to examine. As a matter of fact, I've written another article about this at Cold-Case Christianity, and it's just this idea: does volitional resistance to Christianity, is that really the cause most of the time when people will tell you it's rational? In other words, and it's on this website here at coldcasechristianity.com. You'll see it. Now, what I'm saying here is it a matter of, I'm so smart that I can figure this out, and this is clearly not true? Or is it a matter of, because that'd be a rational opposition to the Christian worldview, or is it a matter of, I'm now so independent, and I think so much of my own reasoning ability that I now have become the arbiter of all truth? And if I don't say it's true, it's not true, because I think I'm the person who can decide truth because I think so much of my rational capacity. I think many times it's the second that leads us away. As a matter of fact, I would argue that everyone who holds a volitional opposition to Christianity, very few of those people are going to tell you that they don't want it to be true because they think that they're God. They're not going to say it that way. Instead, they're going to pose it. They're going to pitch it as though it is a rational objection. I've just examined the evidence and I've discovered that the evidence is wanting. Well, that's really how it's going to sound. But where's that coming from? A lot of people haven't examined the evidence. They just have decided that they are smart enough that they don't need the evidence. They can be the arbiter of all truth. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I think there are good reasons to believe that Christians are smart. And there are many smart Christians who, for the most part, have decided that Christianity is true because the evidence that these other causal factors in space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, those things are left wanting. There's no, you don't see a way that those could explain the experience we've had. How do you explain mind with it? How do you explain the origin of the universe? How do you explain the fine-tuning in the universe? How do you explain the origin of life or the appearance of design in biology? How do you explain mind and free agency and this thing that we call objective evil, which things are evil? Really, what's the objective standard of good you're comparing that to? And finally, how do we judge something as morally virtuous or vile if there is no objective, transcendent moral standard? Look, in the end, it seems to me that of the two possible explanations, a divine being who is the cause of all we see in the universe, or nothing more than the unguided processes and forces of space-time matter being acted on by physics and chemistry, it seems to me that the first explanation goes a lot further in explaining the world as we experience it. Now, you may not believe that. This doesn't mean that Christianity is true. This just means that a theistic worldview is the best explanation for what we're experiencing. Now, we get there. We try to get there by using our minds and looking at the evidence. But the question is, when you read a report like I showed you at the SAGE site that argues that religious people are statistically dumber, okay, than people who are atheists, well, then what do you do with that? Now, so this is my point. What is it about people who find themselves smart, or somehow get labeled as smart? They get tested, and the proclamation is made. You're a smart person. What is it about that person that then causes them to resist God's existence? Is it just that they are smart and they looked at the evidence, or is it that their perception of their own self-smartness is the real barrier? So I want to show you many ways in which believers demonstrate that wisdom isn't always attached to your IQ. And in fact, sometimes your self-perception of having an IQ can be an obstacle. We'll do that right after the break.
In addition to Jim's daily blog and weekly podcasts and videos, Jim continues to write books designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker. These resources will help you defend what you believe and share it with others.
Knowledge puffs up. This is what Scripture tells us. And it's true, even if you didn't believe that line of Scripture. We see this all the time, right? So that's the question. Well, it turns out that people who are believers, religious people, for the most part, make what even non-religious people would consider to be wiser choices in the long run. Let me show you several areas in which this is true statistically. Here's the first. Believers make wiser choices in their relationships. Now, I'll tell you that there's been lots of studies about this. I'll show you a couple here that'll just kind of make my point. But I've written more about this online. But here's one, for example. This study reveals that believers are more inclined to enter committed relationships and more likely to make wise marriage choices. For example, they are statistically usually polled, and they enjoy better marital stability and remain satisfied in their marriages. This is, when polled, you see this over and over again, that a religious belief that is practiced by both people in the relationship leads to better results. But it's not just that. You'll see all kinds of other smaller. Look, I'll give you an example of this. We know sometimes we get accused, right, of, oh, well, you Christians, you divorce at the same rate as non-Christians. Well, not actually. That's not true. As a matter of fact, we've seen a number of studies, like this one, for example, that show that when spouses are both actively engaged in their religious communities. In other words, if you're going to church and you're part of a community, you can just not just saying you're a Christian, but you're actually involved in the things that identify you as being a Christian, you are more than 2 times less likely to get divorced. More than 2 times. So this idea that that we divorce at the same rate, well, only if you're polling people who just asking, are you a Christian or not? Yes. Okay. Well, do you actually do anything associated with Christianity? Are you part of a community? Do you attend church? Do you care? Do you ever pray? Do you ever read your Bible? Well, yeah. If you're not doing those things, you're just a Christian in name only. You're probably divorcing at the same rate as other non-Christians. But if you're somebody who's exercising your faith, who's living out your faith, you're much less likely to get divorced. Here's the other thing. Believers make wiser choices in their parenting. I'm going to show you 3 separate polls on this. They make wiser choices in their parenting. And look, we've talked about this before too, that the statistics for the well-being, I mean, all the time, a lot of non-believers talk about the well-being of children, the well-being of the species, or the well-being of the future of the species, which, by the way, will involve children. Well, it turns out that if you're somebody who is concerned about those things, understand that believers make better choices. I'll give you an example of one of these polls. Here, for example, in this poll, this survey, it shows that believing mothers and fathers, they make wiser choices. They are more involved, according to this survey, in the lives of their children. They are more involved, and they're more involved in every aspect of the lives of their kids. For example, I'll show you another poll here that demonstrates they are not only more involved in the lives, they're more involved in their educational experience. And they also, based on which poll you read, and all the polls will show that we do better in these areas, but it's a matter of how much better. You'll see that, according to polls, parents who are raising up their kids as believers have stronger and better relationships by every metric by which we measure these kinds of things. How do we say stronger, better? How much time do you spend? How much do you bond after they've grown up? Over and over again, you will see that the choices we make as believers, in trusting that this worldview in which God exists and Christianity is true and Jesus is the Son who rose from the grave and prepares us for eternity and allows us, through the grace of God, to accept the gospel, accept what He did for us. When we teach that, when we live that, and we teach that to our kids, we have better metrics in terms of, by the way, this is always the case, right? When you have 2 biological parents in a low conflict setting, you get better results regardless. But the question is, how do you get a long-term commitment of 2 biological parents in a low conflict? Well, it turns out that Christianity does a lot to aid in that process. So that might explain why we have better results. Let me give you another way in which believers make wiser choices. And that is that believers make wiser choices related to early sexual activity. early sexual activity. I'll just give you a couple of surveys that are done here. And again, I'm not naming all of these for you because they're all linked in that article. So if you really wanted to dig through these, but to be honest, if you just Google this stuff, you'll be shocked to find how honest surveys are about the relationship between religious belief and better outcome. But okay, let me give you a couple of these here that just talk about early sexual activity. Here's the first one. And this one just basically says that the more committed you are as a believer, and the more you are committed to your religious practice, whether you're a male or female, the lower the level of teenage sexual activity. Now, I get it that sometimes you'll hear stories of hypocrisy within the church in which there's sexual activity or any kind of horrific activity that shouldn't be involving a number of people, including leaders. I get it. We hear those stories. But on the average, when you poll the entire group, you will see that the more committed you are to your religious belief, the lower your sexual activity before marriage. That shouldn't surprise you, right? But that's just the way. Now, you might get to a point where we're saying, hey, that's not even virtuous. That's not even something we would promote. We want young people to be sexually active. If we get to that point, well, what can we say? But for now, we know that if that's our desire, is to hold off sexual activity until people can make wise choices as adults, at least. If that's all you had, if you had those modest ambitions, well, then religious belief would actually help that. Let me show you another survey. This one shows that committed believers are 2 to 3 times less likely to have a child out of wedlock. Now, you might say, well, who cares if kids are married or had out of? As a matter of fact, I just read the other day that now the average age of somebody having their first child is now lower than the average age of somebody getting married. It's the first time I think it's ever been that way. So we see a lot more that people think that somehow cohabitation is equal to traditional marriage. And it's not in any statistical measurement. I just saw, for example, measurements in terms of longevity of life. And even co-inhabitants who are living in the same, but they aren't married, don't live as long or have a wellness that rates as high as those who are married. So in the end, it's not the same. And it turns out if we think that we want to advance the idea that we have less kids born out of wedlock, well, then one way we could try to achieve that goal would simply be to have a religious worldview, to help them to be believers, because believers make wiser choices about early sexual activity. Let me give you another way that believers make wise choices. And that is that believers make wiser choices in their use of alcohol and drugs. That probably isn't all that shocking either. I'm only going to show you one study here, but as I'm looking at my notes, I can see that there's just a ton of stuff out there in this regard. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, most 12-step programs at least ask their people who are going through the program to ponder and consider higher powers of some nature, because it turns out your belief in theism, your belief in God's existence, does have an impact even on 12-step programs. So that shouldn't surprise anybody, right? But let me show you one of these surveys, one of these studies done that just demonstrates that the more you are committed to your religious belief, you have a reduced likelihood of alcohol abuse. You have a similar relationship between religious commitment and drug use, reduced use of drugs. Religious people are far more likely to not use, or far less likely, I should say, to use alcohol and drugs in an abusive way. So there's another way in which religious people make wiser choices. Isn't it interesting? The people who allegedly are not as smart from an IQ perspective make wiser choices so far in a number of... Let me give you another category. Believers make wiser choices in just the way they live their lives. I'll give you a couple of studies here because this may seem like it's a little bit generic, but committed believers, let me show you the first study, committed believers are less likely, for example, to commit acts of violence. And you see this over and over again, especially against their partners. So if you're looking at domestic violence and you think, well, that's something we ought to limit, well, one way you could limit this is that if everyone's a religious believer, they're much less likely to do harm to each other. There's other studies that also show that incarceration rates, but let me show you another one here. This one shows that believers report they're just happier in general. They're more satisfied with their lives. They have greater morale. You see this over and over again in different studies. As a matter of fact, this study here about the happiness is from Baylor. But you'll see this a number of different surveys that are not from, they're just from psychology organizations that are not vested in the Christian worldview, do not hold openly religious views. They are doing this as secular groups studying happiness in terms of well-being. How long do they, how much do they, how sick do they? We just did one of these that talks about how happiness is tied to marriage, traditional marriage, the way we see it described in Scripture. And we see that under any number of metrics. You can look for it in our NRBtv archive, or you can look for it on our YouTube archive. What is the secret to happiness? Well, statistically, it's marriage, traditional marriage as described and as experienced by religious believers. Let me give you another way that religious believers make wiser choices. Believers make wiser choices related to, guess what? Education, the very thing that sometimes people think separates the smart from the unsmart, from the dumb, right? We are educated. I've learned a lot. I learned so much that I can no longer be a Christian. How many times have you heard something like that? Well, it turns out, I'll show you a couple of surveys that give you some insight here. It turns out that we have higher academic expectations. We attend school more regularly. We achieve higher levels of education, and generally, according to this study, we perform better in our academic environment. So forget about just measuring IQ. If you're looking at who performs better in an academic environment, we've got studies that show that people who are believers actually make better choices and perform better in terms of education. Let me give you another survey here. Some studies even show us that academic performance is positively impacted. So it's not just that first study I showed you, but there's many of these that show that it's not just positively. We're measuring grades, right? We're measuring rates of graduation. All of these things are positively affected by someone's religious beliefs, and if they put those religious beliefs into practice. That's a key part to almost in all these surveys, is are they practicing their religious? This is why the exercise of faith in the country is so important. Was never designed to be so we could be allowed to believe things as long as we believe those things privately. No, we're actually arguing that we have to exercise our beliefs in order for them to have a positive impact on culture. If you want all these benefits, if you want to succeed in all these areas we're talking about so far, belief standing by itself is not enough. It's the ability to practice your beliefs because it makes it real. It's people who are practicing their beliefs that are really true believers anyway. So we can say, well, are you a believer? But the reality of it is, if you're not practicing what you say you believe, are you really a believer anyway? Let's jump quickly to the next area in which believers make wiser choices. And that is that believers make wiser choices related to compassion and charity. That's right. You see this over and over again, right? If you wonder, well, what would happen to our culture what would happen to all the areas in which humans in our culture are acting compassionately and charitably if you removed all religious organizations, churches, and believers? How many people do you think are actually doing this kind of charitable work? Who do you think gives more? Who do you think serves more? Who do you think raises up more orphans, takes care of more widows, if you don't think it's Christians? You'd be surprised to find maybe, but it turns out that we've got a long history of practicing what it is we preach. Not everyone does it. I get that. That's why these kinds of surveys are focused on the people who have been allowed to exercise their faith and who have chosen to exercise their faith. So let me show you a survey here that kind of makes it clear. There's a bunch I could do, but I'm just trying to link to the quickest ones. You are far more likely to report compassionate, empathetic feelings toward people who are disadvantaged if you're a believer. And surveys show this. This one here shows that the heightened compassion we have as believers usually motivates us to be more charitable. Believers give far more to charitable organizations than do non-religious people. It's always been the case. So in the end, even your compassion levels are higher. They're reported higher on different statistical surveys, and you act on those compassionate feelings you have for others. Let me show you another way that believers make wiser choices. We make wiser choices, as I started to kind of tease out earlier, related to criminal activity. So I'll just give you, I'm not going to give it to you from like a DOJ kind of Department of Justice site. I'll just give it to you here from this one survey that I've looked at before. It's pretty good in terms of its complexity, in terms of its depth, and it basically makes this case. There's a direct relationship, according to this survey, between religious belief and criminal activity. In other words, committed believers are just far less likely to use weapons. They're far less likely to engage in violent activity. They're even just far less likely to engage in non-violent, felonious crimes. Religious believers are just far less likely to do things that land themselves in jail. And I get it. We have the famous stories of those who do make mistakes, but this is the exception to the rule. All right. All this being said, here we are, right? We're down to, well, do we think then that there's something about IQ that determines, well, yes, there may be something about IQ that determines whether or not you're a believer, but it's not that you are so smart that you've necessarily looked at the evidence and that's what's keeping you out on a rational basis. For the most part, it's those three things that motivate bad behavior, right? Sex, money, power. Those three things. Those are beautiful things, but we have a tendency to corrupt them. And when we corrupt them, power especially, we become so prideful that we're just not willing to listen, that we become our own gods. And if you don't think that's the case, how do you explain the incredible history of thoughtful Christians? Look, I've given one article on this, the rich historic roll call of great Christian thinkers and scientists. And if you go there, you will see, I don't know, maybe 70 or 80 in the history. But it turns out I assembled for the next book, Person of Interest, 950 scientists who were either cutting-edge scientists who were the founders or fathers of all major scientific disciplines, even up into and including in the modern current era. To say that the people who have a high IQ simply cannot be Christians, like it's just automatic. If you learn enough, you're going to get out of that system, is just not true. There are lots of smart Christians in the sciences, in academia, in philosophy, who are writing even today. And it turns out that those who are labeled as smart may not want Christianity to be true for other reasons, because they believe they're more self-reliant. They don't listen. Once you think you know something, you stop learning. And this is often the case for people who are labeled. So just be modest about what we think we know and who we think we are. And realize that at some point, the whole Christian life is my bending my knee to the God who created me, who I'm guessing is probably smarter than me. That being the case, I hope this has helped you to think through that claim that religious people are dumb and that atheists are the smart ones.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.